All right, welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I am back with Skyler and Bogdan, and we have a third guest, John Drexler. John, you want to say hi?
Hello. Hi. I cannot imagine a better topic for that. The way that you teed that up is so perfect. Yeah. I'm excited to be here.
So, John is a partner at Thunk, I guess, and does some product management consulting for us, and recently did a really cool product for devs talk at the PHP NYC meetup. And I guess even though Skyler and Bogdan, you've been on a bunch of times, you want to say a quick hello as well, a quick intro.
Sure. Hello. Good to be back. What's up, guys? Excited to talk about today's topic. I hope you guys are as well. Hopefully in the title it's going to say how crazy this is, but
so basically, Skyler and Bogdan and I work together, and John's been doing some consulting with us, and we were talking about development team practices, things like sprints and ticket estimation and stuff like that. And to even step back a tiny bit further, John did this great talk at the PHP NYC meetup about just like product practices for developers and sort of thinking like a PM, that asked a few questions that kind of got me thinking like, or questioning some of our practices. And so this morning we were in an actual like retro meeting, and just the questions led to a really interesting conversation. And we were just kind of like, we should stop and just come back and hit record and do a podcast. So that's where we are. And so without getting into it too much, to get to the conversation quickly, like the basic question was just, we do ticket estimation. We do 2-week cycles or 2-week sprints. We use linear and are trying to get a little bit better about like some process things around the way our team works. And the initial sort of question that started this was, is estimating tickets useful in a team where you don't really need to use that to demonstrate your value? Because I think in a lot of ways, sort of using ticket estimation is off a metric of like developer productivity, but in a team where you don't have to necessarily demonstrate that you're productive, what other uses does it have? But that kind of opened up to this question of like, do we even need sprints? Like what processes actually matter? So I guess I'll open that up. John, do you want to like talk a little bit about some of your thinking that sort of initiated this conversation?
Yeah. So like you did a good job of teeing it up. I think I'll caveat it first by saying what I said to you guys a minute ago, which is just like, this is not yet a strongly held opinion. I do feel like I have to like clarify that on the, the FG scale, as we like to do, is like, there's things that I care about a lot more than this. This was just an interesting, like exploratory question that I couldn't get a satisfying answer for. And I kept on asking smart people and couldn't get a satisfying answer for, which is like, I'm at a point in my career where I believe in like product minimalism, like do as little process as you need to do in order to ensure that you're working on the most important stuff and everyone has clarity on what they're working on. So I'm a big fan of like cherry pick the stuff from Agile that works and don't do the rest of it, do as little as possible to make sure that everything works well. And so I like the idea of like canceling stuff or like not even doing some of the rituals if they're not super productive for you. And at my last job, we were a bigger company, and there was, we had like the normal sort of communication problems that you have with a large development team. And we needed to like demonstrate our value to the executives. So we got like, my team actually got really good at estimating. We would like plan out a big project and estimate every ticket in it, and could actually get like a pretty credible estimate of how long it was going to take. And I always wondered, like, what did we get from that? Like, we did this whole huge planning exercise and this huge estimation exercise. Like, what did we really gain from that exercise other than like getting executives off of our backs? And it wasn't clear to me. So then when I came to Thunk, I was just telling you guys a story where like we were doing a project recently, or we're actually in the middle of a project, which basically had no process at all. It was just kind of like three good developers crushing tickets, and it was like we had this big monolithic pile of tickets. It was like loosely prioritized, but it like kind of wasn't even that prioritized. And people would just pick up the next ticket, do the ticket, and it worked. And it was like, oh, right. If we don't have these communication problems, if we don't have this kind of like distrust from executives, there's no need for these tickets to have an estimate on them. So it led to this conversation with me and Daniel, my partner at Thunk, who basically I was like, why do we even estimate tickets? And it was like, well, it's partly to get the executives off your back. It's partly also so you know how much fits into a sprint. But then it was like, well, why do we even have sprints? And I couldn't get to a good answer. And I kept on asking smart people, like, why do this other than to prove to executives that you're working? And nobody had a good answer. And so like Chris and I were talking about it last week, and Chris was like, maybe we should like consider whether or not we need to do that. Anyway, I have more thoughts on this, but that's my long intro.
Yeah. So, I mean, my initial reaction was it's useful to look at past cycles and say, well, we completed about this many tickets or this many points. So when we're planning our next cycle, like we know generally about how much is realistic to put on there. And I think there is some value in that. But it started to get me thinking, like, is there enough value? And I think Skyler, you kind of came out with let's abolish it all. Like, who needs sprints? Who needs estimates? Like, let's just have.
Who even needs the backlog?
Well, yeah.
Really, my hottest take is that like if something is on the backlog for more than 90 days, it should just automatically be deleted. It was clearly not important, and if it's important, it'll come back. That's my hot take about backlog.
I get it.
I think with a sprint, like the idea that we're gonna get this stuff done, at the beginning of the sprint, like everything looks good. You come down to the day before the sprint ends and there's 4 tickets left, and you're like, well, we did a lot. I worked hard this sprint, but there's 4 tickets left. So like, did I work hard enough? Maybe not though, because there's 4 tickets left. Whereas if you just had your prioritized backlog and you were pulling the items off, and every 2 weeks we were celebrating what went well and what didn't go well, like you still are getting the same amount of work done, but there's less of guilt of like, you didn't do these things you said you were going to do. But, different there
are different types of ways of thinking about this, because I think what was most interesting and what kind of made me say, like, let's stop and actually record this is, I think, Bogdan, you like basically came out with the exact opposite position, right?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, to speak to the point about estimation, I mean, aside from like satisfying corporate, numbers, luckily we don't have to do that here, but I know it's important in other teams. It is obviously a good way to also gauge the performance of the team, a number of tickets. But I think the real idea, at least in my mind, as far as estimating tickets, is really figuring out how big this ticket is. Because if we don't estimate tickets and we're just, we're just going to create this huge feature, well, that's obviously a lot more work than fix a small bug somewhere on just like a color change. And just knowing that difference and having the ability to explore that, I think is worthwhile. I recall Skyler kind of mentioned the same thing earlier, where if you have a big ticket, that means maybe you need to split it up. Earlier in a conversation that we had before we started recording. So I think that's probably the biggest, most compelling reason to do estimations. If you're not using them to size up your team, great. But I think it's like a really good way to say, like, is this a big ticket, small ticket, or a large ticket? So I think that's my position, at least on estimation. And if I may, I mean, as far as sprints, I feel like, I come from a different mindset. I come from, kind of the world of like setting goals, like even just to give you an example, like on my refrigerator downstairs, we'll have like a shopping list, right? Well, that shopping list is important for this week or the next like few weeks. I don't make a shopping list for an item that I need to buy a year from now. At the very bottom of this list, it's like, here's a thing that we've committed to doing this week. And that's kind of what we're preparing for. And the nice thing about that is, like, when you remove that item, there's a satisfaction that you have, like you've completed that entire list. And that's how I feel about sprints. Like, you say, okay, well, out of this backlog of tickets, we're going to select 5 tickets or whatever. And, when I complete 4 out of 5, that's like 80% done. That's like a really good thing. Whereas I feel like when you don't have this kind of formality to set for per se, you could you could get into a situation where you just feel burnt out. Like, you're never getting, there's no end in sight. You're constantly working nonstop, even though you are working nonstop anyway, basically. But there's like this period of time where you're kind of like giving it a go. So at least that's my position. I can give you another example in a little bit, but how does
I
that
do
sound to
think
you?
that's totally valid. It's funny because as you said that, in front of me on my desk I have this stack of purple note cards, which is like every goal that I've had over the last 6-7 years. That I like write them all
Mm-hmm.
down and sort them and stuff. I'm like, I that makes a ton of sense to me. Actually, it's just like psychologically setting a goal and going after it, and then knowing whether or not you hit it on a regular basis is a good feeling. I totally get that.
Yeah. I'll give you another example. I used to do motorcycle racing back in the day, and we used to have like a season, right? Like, there you have to go to multiple racetracks and do all these races. And during one day, during one weekend, you may do like 3 or 4 races. So, when you look at it from a whole, kind of like zoomed out, like, obviously you need to do all this stuff, but like when the weekend comes to actually do this race, well, you're training for this weekend, right? Whether that's physically or making adjustments to your motorcycle. After that weekend, you take that information and you improve it on the next weekend. You reset your mental state to do this other sprint. And it just so happens that these races were also called sprints. And so that's kind of like, I think, what has been in the back of my mind this entire time. Like, all right, well, I'm just doing this like one race, and like, after this race, I need to see what went well, what didn't go well, how we can improve that on the next race. Because otherwise, like, again, eventually the gas is gonna run out on your brain, and you're gonna tumble and fall. I feel like that's at least how I operate.
I mean, I agree that it's good to go back and see, like, how did we do, but it is very rare that as a team we finish every single item in to do each sprint. Most of the time there's a handful that carry over, and linear just like carries it over, and then you go back to look at the sprint later and you're like, oh well, there's nothing in to do. But like,
Well,
what is, like, psychologically, to me, like, we fail every sprint because we don't complete it.
I also would challenge that question. Like, I can't think of a time when I've gone back to a sprint to see, like, other than looking at the just aggregate numbers of like how many points in average we complete on a sprint. I've never looked at a past sprint.
Well, and this gets to like the question that I was sort of asking even at my last team where we got really good at this. And I'd argue you guys are pretty good at it. Like, you guys block off a big chunk of tickets and you get most of them done every cycle. And like, that's better than a lot of teams that I've interacted with. So like, I think you guys are pretty good at it. My last team was pretty good at it. Like, but I kept on running up against this where I was like, what did this get us? It's like, we figured out that this project was exactly 56 points and we finished it, just 3 days after we thought we would finish it. And so our roadmap for that quarter was pretty accurate. And it was sort of like, so what? Like, what did we know what our sprint velocity is now. Like, what productively did we achieve?
So I have three concrete thoughts here. And I'll say the one first, which is kind of like the more traditional thinking about this, I think, which is just, when you are planning, having a general sense of how long something is going to take is useful, right? When we're talking about, over here, we might have, let's say, a dozen projects that are like sort of reasonably on the horizon, and say 3 or 4 that we're actually sort of thinking about as being like on the agenda. And it's like the difference between thinking, okay, this project is going to take, 3 sprints versus this project is going to take some unknown amount of time. There is concrete value in that. So that's one point that I want to make, just sort of thinking about the traditional planning approach to things. The thing that I came to our retro today with that I think is an interesting idea, and I'd be curious to get more specific feedback on, is sort of twofold. The one is, we've been using sprint planning to be a little bit more thoughtful about putting tickets that all like essentially point us in the same direction, right? We've kind of been talking about the value of everyone on the team being generally focused on the same things for a given cycle, rather than like one person working on one project and the other 2 people working on a different project, or all 3 of us working on 3 different projects. Like, I think as a team we have acknowledged some value in like all of us being sort of working on the same thing. We get more value out of pairing. We get more value of just like not having to do so much context switching, all that stuff, right? And so there's an argument for, well, okay, maybe we have 15 things at the top of our like ready list that are all pretty important, but 6 of those 15 things are all on the same project. And we can kind of generally agree that like that project is, on the roadmap as one of the top priorities. So like, let's take this sprint to really focus on that project so that we're not like jumping around. And I think that's a compelling argument for like sort of not just picking necessarily the absolute top of the list of priorities, but like kind of looking at the top 15, 20 different things and sort of picking a theme for a period of time. The other thing that I would say is I could see a world where we continue to do some planning for cycles, but we're mostly putting tickets onto the cycle that have some sort of time requirement, whether maybe it's not as specific as a due date, but just like this needs to happen soon. So we want to like specifically put it on this cycle so we know it gets done in the next 2 weeks. And like maybe a given cycle would only have 4 tickets on it, and then the rest of the work that gets done on that cycle is stuff that's at the top of the prioritized backlog, but that you kind of still have that place to say, we as a team want to commit to these 4 things getting done in the next 2 weeks. And everything else is, just pick from the top priorities. But there's a little bit of thought that goes into, it may be that there's one thing at the top of the list that's super urgent, but like after having a conversation, we know that it can wait. Like its urgency comes up in 3.5 weeks, right? The next 2 weeks, as long as we know that we commit to it in the next cycle, we can wait, right? And so taking that moment to plan and kind of say, these are the things that we're prioritizing. I think there's potentially value there, but I'm like you said, John, like my like FG is pretty low still. It's just like a thought,
Yeah, I mean, I think like I feel like a 3 on the FG scale about all of this. I mean, I feel like an 8 on getting rid of the backlog, but like in this, I think we tend to find ourselves setting a priority and leaving it at that priority. And if something's urgent, but it's not actually due for 4 weeks, then like it's not really urgent and it shouldn't be marked as urgent. And if we're going to all decide that we're going to work on, project A together, then we just filter the backlog to project A's tickets and work on what's urgent. But I like the idea of putting in a handful of specific items and then pulling everything else off of what is truly important right now. And, you've had this concern that we're not going to the backlog enough. And I think part of that is that we're just we're not looking at the backlog. But if we were getting rid of putting everything in a sprint, you'd be more inclined to look through the backlog.
Yeah.
Also, we don't look at the backlog because it's not important. Because if it was important, then the team, all of the various other people at the company would be bringing it up again.
And that's where you get into some of the wish list stuff helps us clarify a lot of that. I do think I guess part of why I think this conversation is interesting is because it does drive us back to one of the main things I guess we've all been talking about. What we're circling around right now is the backlog. And I think that basically in terms of problems, this is what I've been saying for a little while is as in terms of problem solving product processes at InterNACHI, there's a lot of problems that I think you guys don't really have. And so right now you're in a position where I think sprint to sprint, you guys are working on the most important stuff that you guys want to be working on. And then also, sprint to sprint, the estimation stuff is going well, you're getting most of the stuff you commit to done, and you're hearing the needs from other teams and prioritizing that stuff appropriately. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm this is not a problem to solve really. The big thing that is clearly the problem to solve is in order to have a good sprint, or even if you theoretically moved away from sprints, you still need this giant list of good stuff that's ready to work on, that is hopefully prioritized in a reasonable way. In order to have that, you have to have sat down and talked about is this ticket too big? Are we sure we want to do this? What's the priority? Is there a due date? And let's talk through some implementation questions together. And that's the real bottleneck. And I guess that's to me why this conversation is good, is because it drives it back to that, because it's in terms of spending all of your time doing really valuable stuff that actually solves problems. It's all the time that you're writing code or pairing, great. It's crystal clear to me how that solves problems, and that's really good. Doing a retro, I'm a huge fan of retros. It's totally clear to me how that's super useful. The estimations and sprint planning, I'm I could take it or leave it. I don't really care. The thing that really matters though is that is the only missing part is is queuing up tickets that are really ready to be worked on. And I would argue that we are low on that time right now, and we don't spend enough time there. And instead we do spend an hour and a half or whatever estimating and sprint planning. So I'm if you just took all the time that we were estimating and sprint planning and instead put that into scoping out, clarifying more tickets, that to me sounds like a way more useful time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a compelling argument for sure.
I mean, I will have to push back a little bit, because I feel when we're doing our sprint planning, I feel we've already at that point have already ironed out some tickets. Yeah, there's some tickets that come in kind of last minute, but for the most part, we already have a pretty good idea of what is coming up on the pipeline. And I think one of the benefits I feel of preparing for a sprint is going back through the backlog and refamiliarizing yourself with what tickets need to be worked on, maybe checking in with the necessary people to figure out hey, is this still important? Because it was important on the backlog a week or two ago, but like we want to put it on a sprint now. Is this still an issue? Like it's an opportunity for you to kind of get some feedback before you start working on it. Maybe there's something else that's more important now. And I feel like, one issue that we've also had, for example, like planning out or shaping tickets far in advance, is that we'll work on a ticket, we'll, shape it, put it in a backlog, and then like 2 months goes by. And we're looking at this ticket and we don't know, like, if it's English or Russian or another language. It just looks foreign, so it's also very difficult trade-off to go and put everything into a backlog, where instead we could be like shaping pre-shaping tickets for like the next sprint or two, and then that like in the next week or two we're going to put this stuff into this bucket. The entire team is kind of aware of how much work that's going to take in terms of effort, and then you can group similar tickets, which I do agree, like if you're so you don't have to do a lot of context switching. I think that's pretty clear win. So I think that's my kind of position on it, like being able to prepare for tickets and plan them for the next sprint or two, rather than like shaping a bunch of stuff, putting them in a bucket somewhere and some backlog. And, whenever it comes up, but,
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I think we can all agree that like the farther out into the future things get, the less certainty we have, right? Like it is easy as developers to imagine that we're going to know what we care about in a year or whatever, but we basically never are right. And so I think that's a compelling argument that like when you think about things in cycles, it does put you in a position to be like, let's give more time and attention to things that we know are going to happen soon versus, I can see losing a little bit of track of that. I think that there are ways around it potentially, but I do think that's an interesting point.
But if I may say one more thing, I feel like this is the main difference between like agile development and say waterfall development. Like we don't plan this huge project for a year. We plan little chunks, and we kind of like, adapt as we go. This feature was cool, but we have to shape it, change the direction of it. Because otherwise, if we pre-plan everything, we're going to get into a situation like with waterfall development, where we basically are writing code that nobody cares about because the requirements changed halfway through the development cycle, because we pre-planned everything.
Yeah,
it's interesting because like with sprint planning stuff, like part of why people talk about agile and sprint planning is like, oh, it's so adaptable and flexible. But I'm like, what could be more adaptable and flexible than not even committing to a sprint and just doing the next most important ticket?
Well, you need some structure. Sorry, Skyler, for interrupting you a second time.
2 weeks, 2 weeks is arbitrary. Like in 2 weeks, something we started 2 weeks ago could be like vastly not important. And something else could be way more important. And like, we don't say we're not going to work on it because the sprint is locked. Like we start working on the most important thing right away.
Yes.
And then the sprint has tickets in it. And then we get to the end of the sprint and we're like, well, we had this other thing, but we also had these tickets. What if we just didn't have those? What if we just didn't have those tickets in to do until you were like, all right, I finished this ticket today, and now I'm looking at like, what is the most useful thing I could do next, and like look at the backlog, like look at the top 10 that are finished, or like your boss goes on vacation and you just do whatever you want, and like like that happens too.
Okay, I think that this gets at one of the big questions, or one of the big sort of like philosophical things that I have here, which is, John, you've talked about how a lot of process comes down to trust. And I think that's true. But I think that for me, what I'm looking for out of process is clarity and certainty. And I think that in a lot of ways that comes down to just the way that my brain works. And like, I have ADHD. I need to externalize a lot of information, and I need to have systems that I rely on. And in a lot of ways, like, that's why, Skyler, when you say let's just delete the whole backlog, like my heart rate like jumped significantly, because it's like, I know for me, things that are incredibly important, if I don't look at the list and see them, I will totally forget about them. And obviously, if we're in a better place now where anything new that's gone on to the backlog is prioritized in a way that it's harder to lose track of.
I think like I worked at a company for 8 years, and like when I first started, we were on Trello. We had a ton of stuff in backlog. Then we moved to Jira, and we moved all that stuff over. And then we moved to Azure DevOps, and we moved all that stuff over. And there were tickets that like we moved 3 systems over 8 years, and we never did it.
Yeah.
And every time I'm like, why don't we delete this? Like we're not gonna do it. Or if we are gonna do it, it's gonna look vastly different than what was there. I think
it's a security
like
blanket.
When I say delete, like linear is not removing that forever. Like it's just not sitting there taunting you of like
Right.
this thing that I should be doing, but I'm not doing. And like, is it important? Well, like no one in Slack is talking about it. Like our customers, our members, like they're not asking about it in any sort of frequency. And when they do, like linear search is pretty good. And so you start typing something in and it'll show up that there was this canceled ticket, and you just click on it. But I think I recognize like I'm not the boss. Like my own apps have 0 users. So like like my process maybe is like not the good process. Like that's totally fair.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're totally right about a lot of that. But I think that, kind of going back to the clarity piece, it's kind of like with traditional or with like agile-ish sprint planning, there's an existing sort of trusted process for like periodically figuring out like what is the stuff that we should be working on. And I think that if we were to commit to a new process that didn't involve sprint planning, and at least in the same way, maybe we don't get rid of sprints entirely, but maybe we reimagine how sprints work. My worry is now we've given up that like process and we haven't replaced it with anything new. And so I just worry that like, it's all easy to say, well, we'll just pick the highest priority stuff on the list. But like, now when are we checking priorities? When are we looking at due dates? When are we like reevaluating that stuff? Like we would need to replace it with something new. And I don't know what that is. I think is part of it.
I mean, I think we keep the same meetings we have where we're checking in. We meet with all these different teams once a week, checking the priority of stuff, but we don't ever. It's been a long time since we've kind of gone back to them with things that we are thinking about doing soon and saying, is this still important? We're still just taking in like new important things. And like John has helped with this like wish list of here's your top 5. And so if it's a top 5, we're doing it or not doing it, but that's more strategic. My thing is just like pre-putting things on the sprint and then not doing them all because we're doing other stuff. Like to me, it feels bad. Like it feels bad to tell the education team, like, I'm not working on that because I'm working on this. And like, I'll do it in 2 weeks when maybe what I'm working on is not important.
I mean, if I could do a complete circle back to before John got here, the process that we used to have was we would put stuff into the triage and then immediately put it on the next sprint. So it's almost like, you're saying that that's not a good workflow. We should, instead, kind of like just take whatever has come up, whatever issue has come up, and we shouldn't pre-plan strategically as a team of what to do.
We should. I think maybe my point is being slightly mistaken.
Maybe
I'm not saying
skewing
that
it
like
slightly.
we just seat of our pants, do whatever we want all the time. Like we
No
are still
tickets.
shaping tickets. The tickets are well shaped. While I think that in our team,
Let's just
like
rewrite everything and go.
the actual
Yes.
estimation number or size matters less than like if this is too big, it's a sign that we need to keep shaping it more.
Yeah, for sure.
But like, honestly, we plan the ticket and then Chris looks at the proposed implementation and goes, oh, that's a 4. And then like, or, oh, that's a 1. And then like the actual estimation part is like not really team led. Also, it doesn't need to be because we've just like planned out, open this file. We're going to do this. Like we plan those tickets well. I think we should do that. And we have that ready tag. And my thing is like, we should just be pulling from ready, not from to do. Like,
so I think part of it sounds like, at the end of the sprint, when you have tickets left over, you feel psychologically, I suppose, or whatever, that you haven't accomplished the entire thing. But I'm here to tell you, it's okay to finish second, third, fifth in a race. The fact of the matter is that you've done it, because the fact that you've competed in this sprint.
Look, I'm a middle child. I understand what finishing second, third, fourth is.
Yeah, no, I get it, but I feel like that itself
section of the program.
Yes, I feel like that itself is kind of like the whole idea. It's like, yeah, you're not going to win the marathon, right? Maybe you will, but the fact that you've competed and you're walking around with your numbers on your chest or whatever, like that itself gives you a lot of vibe at the end of that race. Like you finished. Like you've survived the 2 weeks. Yeah, you didn't finish 100%. I feel like that to me doesn't bother me as much.
Well, but you're telling Skyler to feel something differently.
Like I mean, I also think though, like we still meet every 2 weeks and talk about what went well, what didn't go well. It's purely the like, if anything, then you're always finishing 100%. Or not, because you're like, you know what, like I didn't sleep well, like I'm just not, like I was feeling off the last 2 weeks, but there's not an additional, I was feeling off the last 2 weeks and we said we were going to get 60 points done and we got 40 and like, there's that additional part.
Well, I have 2 questions for you, Skyler. Like one is, I think I know the answer to this, but like, is the solution, if we were to stick with sprints, to just say the goal is to complete 80% of sprints? Like, does that help at all or does that not help at all?
I mean, I know that the goal has never been 100%. Like the
it's
goal,
just that psychological thing.
It's all psychological. I mean, like this is just, it's a different pace of company. Like I worked at a company that was private equity backed. And so like there was an expectation of you got to get stuff done and you never got enough done. And that's, a lot of unlearning from that to like come to a place where it's just different. And so I know that the expectation's not 100%. It's more like, I don't know, like we're sort of already pulling stuff off of ready when it's important.
Yeah.
And so then my question is like, well, why is this other stuff in the sprint then? And like maybe 2 weeks, like we've shipped too late if we're waiting 2 weeks.
Well, my other question was going to be, would another way to approach this be like, it's okay to take things off the cycle, right? To say like,
totally,
we thought that this was a plan. This made sense for this period of time, but like, is part of the solution just saying like, it's normal for things to be removed after the fact, like that. In fact, we should be rebalancing this stuff in the middle of the cycle when if things look different.
I'll say also, I think one thing that is surprising or interesting to me about this is that this part of it keeps on coming up of like, oh, our priorities are changing, or like you scope a ticket and then shortly thereafter the priority of that ticket changes, or like we pull something into a sprint and mid sprint we decide we don't want to do the ticket. I'm kind of surprised by that. Does that come up a lot?
I think that that's really specifically a factor of the way where our organization is and how we operate. And this kind of comes back to one of the questions that came up in New York is like InterNACHI, we've been around for over 20 years, and we are arguably way, way, way beyond feature complete as a product, right? Like we encapsulate multiple like whole business models within our one application.
Yeah.
So a big part of what we prioritize nowadays is like team member requests and member requests, like, because a big priority is making sure that working at InterNACHI is good and being a member at InterNACHI is good, right? So our planning, there's a big portion of our planning that comes down to roadmap, and I think that the priority of the roadmap tickets doesn't typically change, but over the course of a week, someone on staff might come to us and say, hey, this is a serious issue that someone just ran into. Like, we need to solve this ASAP. And that reprioritizes all the other like internal tickets that we're dealing with. Or someone comes back to us and says, last week I was really frustrated with this, but it turns out like it was just a really bad week for this thing, and like it's slowed down a ton, and like you guys don't have to run to get it fixed in the way that I thought you did before. Those internal requests tend to shift a lot more quickly than the roadmap stuff. So I think because of one of my decisions to make sure that we're prioritizing like the experience of working at the company by like really supporting the folks who work here, and prioritizing like the experience of being a member by really supporting our members, like that changes the way we think about tickets. Like, I think we're probably atypical, a typical, like a startup is not gonna, I think if you are working at a startup and your priorities are changing like mid cycle, that's a way different thing than like here. We're dealing with staff saying like, oh, this actually isn't as big of a problem as I thought it was, or hey, this is a new big problem that I really, if you can, need you to just like drop everything and look at.
I mean, I will say, I kind of heard what you said, but I feel like we're not unique. I feel like all businesses operate in the same way. Priorities shift. All businesses have staff and they have customers that use some sort of product. And if there's an outage or there's something that's going on, you're going to react in the same way. Obviously, I think like a lot of people want, their staff to also have a pleasant experience, supporting using the software and so on and so forth. But, I think like what I kind of heard from this is perhaps rather than like removing tickets, maybe we, kind of what you suggested, Chris, earlier, is instead of overloading the sprint with points, maybe we trim that by 20% or 30%. And then that way there's some room to deal with some of these like urgent requests that, we try to bake some of that time in, but I feel like, maybe an additional few extra, points or tickets, could kind of like ease some of this like incompletion pain points. And I don't know. I feel like when I go into a sprint, I'm like pretty optimistic with like, yeah, of course I'm going to do everything because today is like X day and we have like a whole 2 weeks. And then obviously time goes by and things are more complicated than usually are. So, I think like maybe just reducing it by a couple of tickets or points maybe is a potential solution.
I mean, I think one thing about sprints is like, at least at my old job, like sprints were about reducing risk for the company. And so the goal was like, whatever you're doing in the 2 weeks, like something can be shipped to customers being your support staff, customers being your members, like customer. I don't really get the feeling like we do sprints to reduce risk, like in the same way. I think we're looking at things just a little bit differently. And so part of it is just like is this what?
I mean,
we're not
it's
reducing
focus.
risk. Like it's for focus, but I still think you can meet every 2 weeks to talk about what went well and what didn't. And
Yes. Without having sprints, right?
It's so funny because like at sprint planning last sprint, Chris, you were on vacation and me and Bogdan and John were meeting, and we like pulled some stuff into the sprint and it was looking good. And Bogdan was like so optimistic and like kept wanting to put more stuff in. And I was like, I don't think we need to like put more stuff in. Like other stuff's gonna come up. And Bogdan's like, no, this one's good. Like let's pull it over. And like we have more than normal like in the to-do column at the end of this. And it just it's because other stuff did come up and we worked hard. You know, while
I will say,
we were gone.
Sorry,
it was
I
so
just
funny.
interrupted you. My bad.
Oh, that's okay.
No, just it's funny how this is part of why, like, unique personalities. This is part of why I think every product process needs to be a little bit bespoke and like handmade. Is that the personalities matter, right? It's like,
Yeah.
Skyler's like, look, like I get bummed out when there's stuff that wasn't done, and so it's like, okay, well, like an easy adjustment is like, let's like commit to a little bit less, and then when you get done early, pull something off the backlog because psychologically that feels better for one of the three of us, and like whatever, that's a compromise we can make. And it could be that on another team you have like 5 Bogdans, and it's like, no, let's set like a really ambitious goal, and then that'll make everyone feel good. But it's like it's one way is not right or wrong. It's just sort of like whatever makes the team feel good, as long as we're all still working.
I'm realizing we have not introduced nearly enough steak knives. That's the problem. Like,
yeah, exactly.
You know,
Am I missing something? How do the steak knives?
well,
work?
you know, the top ticket closer gets a set of steak knives.
Oh, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, I think like having a goal to chase, is, I don't know, to me at least, it's always kind of been like, why did I do, say, motorcycle racing, right? Like, why am I doing programming? Well, I need to like close a ticket. I need to do this thing. Like, there is a goal. It's like if I ever want to become a doctor, I can't just go from sitting at my computer or whatever and become a doctor. Like, I need to first get the goal is finish high school. Then the goal is go to college, then do this class, then do that class. Like these incremental steps. And you have to set yourself up like, all right, well, I want to be a doctor. You can't just say, oh yeah, like I'm going to eventually become this thing, whatever that is. And obviously it may or may not work out, but I think like having a priority, a goal in mind, with some sort of like time frame, makes it, converts like, instead of goals being dreams, like goals being a reality, basically.
What if your goals were day by day?
There you go.
Like
Daily goals?
a daily sprint.
Sure, but it's kind of like, okay, well, today my goal is to go to gym. Tomorrow my goal is to go partying. I mean, that's like, I don't know, a pretty straightforward thing. Whereas like, you can be like, okay, well, my game plan for next 2 weeks is to do these things. Obviously, every day I'm going to have to do something, but it's kind of like you have like a bigger picture. Like, that XYZ, it's like a chunk of work. I don't know. At least that's how I put it in my brain. It's, I think Chris said earlier about like putting stuff into boxes, and I don't know, maybe I share the same kind of like mentality, but I like to put stuff into this bucket, and then when that bucket's done, I'm done. It's like I know I have to write an essay for tomorrow's report. Like I'm gonna do it. Like, and then be done with it. Whether it's in the beginning of 2 weeks or the day before, I just know that that's kind of how it is, rather than eventually.
Do you feel like roadmaps could kind of scratch that same itch for you? Like a larger, does it have to be 2 weeks, or could it be like, could you find satisfaction in saying like, okay, or maybe not roadmaps, but projects, like we've got this project, we've got these 3 projects on the roadmap, and this is the one we're working on. And like, it's got this milestone. Like the goal for you is to hit that milestone, even potentially setting like a deadline for it. Like would that kind of scratch that same itch, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as long as, I think like it's like, I think the other question is like, why is it 2 weeks, right? Like, why is this like proven methodology, Chris, that you just kind of mentioned, is 2 weeks? Why is 2 weeks the recommended kind of time frame? Well, it turns out that it works for a lot of people mentally, that it's not like a 6 month sprint, or it's not like a 2-3 month sprint where you kind of set this work and then you go on working. It's smaller chunks. You broke down a 3 month project into like these small little intervals. You can call them milestones if you want. But the sprints, unless you're working on a single project, then it's all the same milestone. But I feel like when you have these 2 week increments, I don't know, mentally it just works. And
I don't
then
know. DHH would disagree with you. They're
dude,
huge fans of 6 week cycles.
I mean, maybe that works for them, but I also seen DHH use a Windows computer, so I don't really trust them. But I don't know. I think that has been working for me ever since I got introduced to like this agile methodology. I had like a really good project manager in my life, one of my first jobs, and he like opened my eyes to like how you can hack the world. Basically, it's not just programming, it's like anything. You can just go put this stuff into 2 weeks, just knock it out, pat yourself on the back and then keep going, because it's very hard to, I don't know, do like a daily thing. I feel like you're going to get burnt out without some sort of like finish line. There is the idea of a finish line, I think, is the key, and it has to be like fairly quickly. It cannot be like a 1 year finish line. It has to be like regular. So anyway, that's my thing with 2 week sprints. I think they work really well.
Okay, so
I think I'm basically. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I'll just say one thing, which is like kind of coming back to the premise of the podcast, right? Like, what's the absolute best way to do things? I actually think there's kind of like a goal that we are setting out to figure out, which is just like, what is the right way for our team specifically? You could argue like, what's a great approach for a small team that's not beholden to like demonstrating their value to an executive team, that like can basically decide within themselves like what process is effective for us to deliver value quickly, right? And do it in a way that feels good for the people on the team, right? So like I just think it's interesting to step back for a second and say, if that's our goal, are there any changes that we want to try that we can like potentially even come back and report on after a month to say like, this is, we're gonna question some things and try some things, but we're gonna hold on to some that we really like. So I'd like to sort of frame the rest of the conversation in that, but John, I'll let you jump into what you were going to say with kind of that in mind.
It's related. So I guess I'd say again, I guess coming back to the framework that I always come from, which is like, what problem are we solving here? The sprints, like, they solve enough problems and they don't come at a high cost to us, right? To continue doing them. It's not like hurting us to do them, really. And they make like Bogdan feel better. They are an easy way to group tickets and to say like, we're working on this project right now. Great. Let's group these these tickets into this sprint. Like, and it doesn't come at a high cost. We could adjust it a little bit to say, let's bite off a little bit less, because then that also accommodates Skyler's feelings about it. And it's like, great. Like, I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I'm like, I could be perfectly fine with just like leave it mostly as is, but do a little bit less. The thing to me that's interesting about it from a process standpoint is that I believe the real juice is having that big list of ready tickets. And I think that if you have a sufficiently large, like, good list of ready tickets, sprint planning actually is a thing that can take about 5 minutes, because what do you need to do? You have like 200 points of good tickets to pull from, and you're like, okay, well, we're going to pull 60 off this list. Great. Let's pull the highest priority ones, group them a little bit thematically, and we're done. So what's interesting to me is like, I still think it pushes back to the actual, like, what changes would you make to sprint planning? I'm like, I don't know that I'd make that many. It sounds like we have one idea, which is just like do a little bit less. And estimating, again, I'm like, I could take it or leave it. We're not spending that much time specifically on estimating. We're more talking about like, what is the ticket? So I don't feel there's like a really big problem to solve there. I think all of this just keeps on pointing back to the bigger problem, which is like, we typically have like just enough tickets and ready to fill out a sprint, which means we don't have enough to have the luxury of being picky in what we pull into a sprint. And that, to me, like, that's actually the one real problem that I think is like worth solving here, I guess.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think to Bogdan's point earlier, I would push back a little bit and say like, you want a big enough list that you can reasonably pull things from it, but you don't want to get that list so big that you're like really planning out tickets that you're not likely to get done in the next few months. Because it's like, I think it's a balancing act. I think we do a really good job of shaping tickets right now. I mean, honestly, one of our problems is we spend a ton of time shaping tickets, and it's, that's something that I want to figure out, because I think it's been really valuable, but we do spend a lot of time, in group meetings, kind of figuring out these like gnarly tickets. But I don't want to go so far that we have tickets that are like at the bottom of that list that aren't going to see the light of day for 5, 6, 7, 8 cycles. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's finding a middle ground of like, there should be a good prepared shaped backlog to pull from, but you don't want to spend so much time on the backlog that you're like planning things that aren't gonna get done anytime soon. It's like a balancing act.
Yep.
I mean, 200 points though, that's like 3.5 sprints. So
yeah,
at any given time, having 200 points. I mean, one thing I will say is that putting less in the sprint to me feels like the worst of both worlds, because what would happen for me, I think, is like, well, the sprint's done and now I can coast, because like we agreed to doing 40 points. And so now like I'm just going to coast, as opposed to like, well, there's no, like, we want to do 60 points a sprint. And so like, we're going to pull tickets in as we determine that they're important. Like, I would rather have tickets left over than like pull 40, because then you get like the psychological push of like, here's the sprint, and then being like, well, we agreed on 40 and I did 40. So now like, I'm just gonna, I'm going to coast here.
What if it was even less though? What if it was like, we've committed to these 4 tickets for the sprint, because like as a team, we know that these 4 really, like, either these 4 really push us in the right direction, like sort of thematically, or they're really timely, right? Or both.
Yeah. Like that would feel better, because it's clearly not like the goal. These are like, these have to get done, and everything else we're pulling in. And we're still aiming for 60 points at the end of the sprint, but we're reprioritizing what's important.
I think part of my pushback against that idea is, I'll just give you kind of like what happened in the last like 2 sprints, right? So we've been working on this migration project. Everybody knows what it is. And, we've planned out, like we probably got like 15, 20 tickets that were put into a backlog or in this ready state. And when we finished that sprint, if you recall, Skyler, that sprint planning probably took 10 minutes. We knew as a team what we're going to do for the next cycle. I literally selected 15 tickets and brought them over to the next cycle. We as a team mentally prepared ourselves what everybody else is going to do. And I feel like there's a lot of benefit to kind of group these tickets, get the kind of like the, whatever the Marines do, like Huya or whatever they're saying, kind of like game plan. We're like, all right, well, this is the mission. It's not like this is the mission and we're going to do these extracurricular activities whenever. You can get lost, I feel like, as a being part of a team. Like you don't know what the actual environment looks like, or however to phrase that.
We brought over all those tickets. Our sprint ends tomorrow, and we have 25 points in.
And I'm okay with that.
For those who aren't watching the video, Skyler's face right now.
And like it doesn't I don't lose sleep over it. Like it doesn't stress me out like it used to. But like, why did we bring over tickets? Like we brought over so many tickets. And I think you even said, well, we're not going to get to it all, but I want to put it in here. And I'm like,
well, why? Because I don't want to work on like, say, the same type of ticket all the time. I want to have some bug fixes. I want to do this, that, third, and you have some variety, but you still kind of have an idea like, all right, this is what we're going to do. And, I also will say the other thing is because Chris has been out for the last part of the sprint, when we estimated those tickets, we've kind of estimated with his ability from the sprint before. So I totally get that part. Yeah. And so, Chris, by the end of the day today, by the end of sprint day, I need you to finish 25 points, please.
No problem.
Well, this does. I mean, it raises an interesting
open source thing real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have 92 points scoped for this cycle, even though normally we do 60 because we just put in so much. Whereas we could have just had all of that in ready and pulled over because we're on track to complete 60 points roughly. Yes. It's just, I think I see the ready tag and you see the to-do tag. I think we see those as the same thing.
Sure.
But we each see them differently.
Yeah, I mean, I personally never go to that ready thing unless like I can't find anything on my board. Like I love the Kanban style like layout. I hate looking up and down the list. I need to go, left to right. And that's just how my brain processes it. Like I need to move this box from here to there. And that to me gives me like a lot of pleasure. And if I have to go to another view and then put it here and move it there, it's a lot of work. So I would much rather like pack the sprint and achieve than underpack it and feel done, kind of like you said, and you feel kind of like cruising or coasting. So I don't know. That's just the way my brain works. I think maybe part of the problem is that.
I think it's worth it could just be worth defining as a team what is the goal there. Is the goal to set the exact right number? Is the goal we're just going to put in here what's like it feels like there's three versions of this. Is like there's like put in the exact right number of what we think we're actually going to do. There's pull in 4 tickets that are just like the things that we know have to get done in this sprint, and then everything else is just pulled off of ready. Or number 3 is like, it sounds like, I don't want to put words into Bogdan's mouth, but it's like, it's almost like the whole like OKR mindset of like, you set a goal with the assumption that like, if you hit 70%, that was success, because like you want to set ambition, you want to be in the habit of like setting ambitious goals. So then it's like, this is what Daniel and I do, is like we set ambitious goals for the quarter. And then it's like, if we hit 70%, that means like you did a pretty good job. If you had 100, it was like too low of a goal. It's like, those are 3 reasonable ways of doing it. But like, you guys should probably all be on the same page about which one you choose, right?
All right. I have 2 thoughts. One is, I think the 70% target is BS. You just renamed 100% to 70%. Just putting that out there.
But it's, I mean, all of these are psychological tricks, right? It's just another psychological trick.
What John just said, he was like, if you hit 100%, then your goal was too low. I feel like that resonates with me a lot.
But the other thing that is kind of an interesting like experiment is, what if we only put tickets for Bogdan on the sprint? I'm dead serious here. Yeah. Like, what if we did one cycle?
Now, there's a tailor-made process.
And this we could make it a friendly competition. I'll go buy some steak knives. let's see.
I don't like steak, so don't bother.
let's see like what happens in terms of like the final number of closed tickets on the sprint
Okay. I mean,
across
I'm
those
game.
two. I mean, I
I
don't
mean,
want to
listen,
I don't want to
Chris,
put you
We've
guys
never
in.
we've never
Chris,
competed ticket to ticket, but
I mean, we can
I'm used to it.
We can do it. It sounds like Skyler is actually up for a competition, which I would think he would not be, but I'm totally game for it. Let's go.
I mean,
I think
I'm not huge competition unless it's board games, but
okay.
I can do my fair
Well,
share of tickets if we need
I
to.
I think it's funny. I don't want to put you in a position to compete because obviously like that's even if it would be totally fine and fun for a cycle, like it's also not necessarily like then useful data for us because it's like under a different set of circumstances. But I would be interested. I mean, I think it's kind of a fun idea to say like, let's try the two methodologies actually at the same time and like get to the end of the cycle and see like, Skyler, was it better? Was it actually better for you to do it that way? Or are there things about like sprint planning that you missed? And like, Bogdan, is it possible to sort of have a cycle that's mostly like where most of the stuff that's planned out, is like stuff that you're going to be taking on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know. It kind of sounds fun. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't actually know in practice if it would be that useful unless in our daily stand-ups we're talking about what in ready is the priority.
Mm-hmm.
Like if if we're not having those conversations, like then we're having that conversation once every 2 weeks, which is
Right.
totally fine because we're planning on stuff going into a sprint. So like we'd have to change some process to like be checking in regularly with taking that hour-long meeting and splitting that up amongst 10 days of time. Otherwise,
yeah, I mean, we could spend a little time in stand-up doing that. I mean, just for the listeners kind of backstory, we used to do a more traditional stand-up that was like, what are you working on? What are your blockers? What did you work on before? What are your blockers? What are you doing next? And I think that for a small team, that just felt so kind of like redundant and kind of like a useless process to be like, yeah, I'm working on the same thing that we all talked about yesterday, or yeah, I'm working on that thing that we're all well aware of that's on this cycle as like the next to do. So we kind of moved away from that and just like think of stand up as a time to check in and have a little social interaction and like actually talk about anything that's like on people's minds. But for 2 weeks we could go back to like, let's actually do a little like process stuff in stand up if that's useful.
I mean, always down to try something new.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting experiment. I think the thing that I do like about that I still want to figure out is I do think it's nice to have something that points us all in the same direction. I think that's been like a good change for us. And that could just be like at the beginning of the sprint, we say, for the next 2 weeks, we're mostly working on this project, right? Or we're splitting up across these two projects or whatever, whatever we would have done for the planning, just do that more at the high level. But that's something that I'd want to make sure we didn't lose.
Totally.
Sounds fun.
I think it will be fun. I also think it will be a disaster to do two different methodologies at the same time. But like I am definitely.
I think the team's so small it won't really matter. Like I can't imagine any like severe negative consequences of this.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be negative. Yeah. I think it'll just feel a little bit manic to be like.
So I'm going on vacation soon, and you guys can try it then.
Sure, Bogdan is going on vacation.
Maybe while Bogdan's on vacation, we just try a like experiment with like a free for all sprint of like, it's not just pull tickets off, check in before you say, send a quick message, say, hey, I'm about to go do 197. Is that cool? And then just do it.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, that'd
tempted
be
to write
interesting
a script to Linear's API to just like cancel all backlog tickets older than 6 months and see
I'm
if Chris
sure you
ever
could
even
just-
noticed this.
I'm sure you could go in there. You don't even have to write the API. Just go in, select all, and delete it. And
That's
call
true.
it
It'd
a
probably
day.
be easy. I still think there's other ways of approaching that, because I think like conceptually I'm aligned, Skyler, but I think there's other ways to like approach it, where like you could also, for example, like remove priority from all of them and say, then like, if we're gonna like really like actually seriously reconsider one of these, it needs to get put back in. For the listener, there's a good triage process at InterNACHI right now where like when you apply the template of a triage ticket, it throws it into triage to be reviewed by the team, and then also like applies a template where you need to write a problem statement and do all this other stuff. So like I still think that could be an interesting idea, is like leave them there, and if something's sitting in the backlog with no priority and no estimate, it functionally kind of is canceled until somebody goes in there and like grabs it and then puts a priority on it, makes it into a real ticket, puts it properly through the triage process, and then it can become a real ticket. So I don't know. I think there are other ways of approaching that, but I feel you.
The other thing that I was thinking about doing, and I may very well just do this now, is like I was thinking about just creating a new team called like Ideas or whatever, and just move everything, all the old backlog tickets over there. That's just like, yeah, we are like, hell, we could even call it graveyard, like we are just acknowledging that these are like, we're not looking or thinking about these at all right now. We're not necessarily like giving up on them. We're just acknowledging that these are like thoughts that people had that may be worthwhile to like sort of scan through from time to time to see if like if there, because this has happened. This is not like theoretical, that like I've looked at old tickets and been like, oh yeah, like we thought about this and had kind of an interesting approach, and now we're talking about it again, and like some of those thoughts are applicable, right? Or even more abstractly, just like the solutions that we were proposing to this idea, or the way we were thinking about this idea, applies to this like more broad or more narrow thing that we're talking about now. And so I do think like having that stuff there to scan from time to time has a little bit of value. And maybe the point is just to say like, be really honest, just kind of like the 4 light bulbs. It's like, we're being really honest with ourselves about where these tickets stand. We're not pretending like they're in queue to be worked on. We're just like, this is a place to look from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, the downside of moving it to a different project or team is that then like the searchability, you'd have to click over to it to be like, did we do this before? Versus just canceling the ticket and then uncanceling it when we want to do it again. But
Right.
I recognize that my brain sees canceled different than your brain sees canceled. So
I think you lose some metadata, right? Because then there's no distinction between we talked about this and decided that we're not doing it versus we didn't do it by default, right? I think that there is a distinction between those two things.
But when it comes to something coming back up in the future, does the distinction matter?
Well, it's not around coming back from the future. It's like, I don't want to go look through old tickets that we like closed because we're never going to do. I only want to go look through old tickets that like we just never got around to. Like, I don't want to sift through the noise of like tickets that we canceled intentionally to see if there are any gems in the tickets that just like we never got to.
And that's where I think, honestly, the status that they're already in, which is backlog, it just is already serving this function. Right?
That's true.
The backlog is the graveyard.
Right.
Yes.
I think there's something that like would be interesting for Linear to do where like if a ticket has a due date, that as it gets closer to the due date, the priority automatically like starts
That
to
would be
rise.
cool. Yeah.
That'd be
And
cool.
if a ticket is medium and has no, like if it's medium or low and it has no due date, that like as time goes on, it goes from medium to low and low to none. Like, and if it's high and there's no due date, then like it's just slowly gets cooler.
Mm-hmm.
But if it has a
Right.
due date, then things start to ramp up, because like that's where like we don't always reset the priority.
Right.
And some of that, it would be
Yeah.
interesting if like the tickets were moving, because we'd see like, oh, this used to be high and now it's not. So like it's just on its own, it's gone lower.
Right.
And then you can reset it to high if you need to.
We could probably write these scripts in an afternoon.
I
Right.
know. I have multiple draft attempts at putting together a nice like linear SDK for PHP, because this is like the thing that we got screwed by the whole GraphQL hype. You know, GraphQL was such a interesting, cool idea, but like it turns out interacting with GraphQL in anything other than JavaScript sucks. And so the fact that the linear API is all GraphQL is really a bummer if you want to like write scripts in PHP to work with it. But
well, hey,
that said,
Chris, you want to work on it together? Because in building paper cuts, I am just about to need a PHP SDK for linear.
yeah, I have a work in progress repository already.
Maybe I'll go look at it.
Yeah, I don't think it's public, but I can get you access to it.
I think if you guys set a goal, I think you guys can accomplish building this API for PHP.
We'll say.
We got to get
We just
rid
need
of
to set,
everything
like,
in
a
the
nice-
sprint, because Chris is, it's like Chris is on vacation. He's working on the new
Yeah.
linear SDK.
Yeah, don't suggest a potential open source project for me to be working on if you want anything else to get done. All right, we have a 2:00, so we actually need to wrap this up. Are there any closing thoughts that anyone has before we go?
No, I think this was a lot of fun. Just talk about this. I think it was great to know Skyler, Chris, and John and their feelings about this, and myself. You know, I feel like I feel like everybody thinks the way I think, and I think it's been eye-opening for me to realize that people do have other opinions.
I think my opinions are in the minority of most people, but
Fair, okay.
but
Well,
it
I think
it is there.
But I think I'm in between. I think my opinions are probably in the minority, and I also think my opinions are always right. So
That is why you are the boss.
there you go.
Well, I do think I like the spirit of experimentation and like accommodating people. I think there's good ideas here, and like it would be fun. It's a fun low cost experiment to like try it Skyler's way while Bogdan's gone, and also try the like hybrid one where we like give both Bogdan and Skyler what they want at the same time. I think that's a cool
where that
idea.
chaotic the chaos is. That's
Yeah.
I think we should do 3 experiments, and then I think we should record another episode. I think we should do one cycle where like we say it's unacceptable to not get every ticket in the cycle done, right? Where like we really commit to like we're only going to put as much work in as we actually think is going to get done. We look at our calendars, we look at everyone's like schedule for the next 2 weeks, and we say this is like realistic and we're going to try to actually finish it. Then we do one where we put nothing on the cycle and see what happens and only pull from ready. And then we do one where half the team does one, half the team does the other, and Skyler does one, Bogdan does the other, and I do somewhere in between, maybe, because
Chris usually does whatever in between.
That's true.
Anyways, like Chris doesn't always follow the sprint.
That's funny.
Sounds awesome.
And we'll see what happens.
One last thought is we can create extra statuses in linear, right?
We could create more backlog statuses. So we
I
could
was gonna
create
say-
like a graveyard status
Yeah.
that's below backlog.
Couldn't we actually just like tease those two things out, and then it's like,
Yeah.
if there's something where we're like, oh, we definitely want to do that, it's just not ready yet, then we still have backlog, but then everything else goes to graveyard.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, we'll have to look into it. All right, guys,
Awesome.
It's been a pleasure. We'll have to follow up sometime. We'll see. But this has been really fun. I hope it's I hope it hasn't just been like totally nonsense to everyone else. I don't think so.
No, I think this is very interesting. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for
Feel
coming.
very honored.
There you go.